This is not an attack on religion, because for millions of people, religion is a deeply meaningful spiritual practice. At its best, it can hold, it can guide, it can nourish the human spirit. What this is that it's an honest look at what happens when something meant to carry meaning slowly begins to lose it. So let's take a closer look.
Faith was never the end, but a doorway we must walk through. Oh, faith was never the end, but a doorway we must walk through.
If it's your first time in these parts, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. This is a space where we explore the deep roots of the ideas that quietly shape our lives. Ideas that shape how we understand ourselves, relate to one another, how we make meaning in our lives, especially so during those seasons when spiritual practice starts to feel a little soulless. Today I want to talk about 5 ways in which religion can drift away from spiritual depth. This is not an attack on religion, because for millions of people, religion is a deeply meaningful spiritual practice. At its best, it can hold, it can guide, it can nourish the human spirit. What this is that it's an honest look at what happens when something meant to carry meaning slowly begins to lose it. So let's take a closer look. The first is when certainty replaces wonder. In a previous video, I shared a reflection on certainty. If you'd like to spend more time with that, I'll leave the link to that reflection in the description below. In that conversation, we made a distinction that there is a kind of certainty that brings grounding, but there's another kind, an inflated certainty that leaves no room for mystery, no room for questions, and ultimately no room for growth. And when that kind of certainty takes hold, curiosity starts to feel like rebellion. Questions start to feel like weakness. But you see, spirituality at its core has always had room for wonder, room for not knowing, room for standing in front of something vast and saying, there is more here than I can fully grasp. And when religion loses that, it may still have the answers, but it begins to lose depth. The second is when performance replaces transformation. It becomes easy to measure spirituality by what is visible. Things like attendance, language, presentation, saying the right thing at the right time, and over time, even the language itself can become recycled. I'm talking about phrases repeated so often that they no longer require reflection, slogans that sound meaningful but no longer ask anything of us. And if we're honest, sometimes those slogans can actually short-circuit thoughtful processing. They give the illusion of depth without the work of wrestling. So instead of being transformed, we learn how to perform transformation. And the danger there is that a person can look spiritually mature on the outside, while something inside remains untouched. The third is when authority replaces conscience. Look, guidance is necessary. Tradition matters, but something shifts when people begin to feel they are not allowed to think, to wrestle, or to discern. Because conscience, that inner voice doesn't form in silence or in surrender. It forms in the tension, in the questions, in the wrestling. That inner voice is not something you're meant to abandon. It's something you come to recognize over time. And you know what? In many ways, it becomes a guide towards meaning. But in some religious spaces, what is presented as revelation can sometimes carry emotional pressure, often from authority figures. It usually comes with a certain tone, a certain urgency, a certain expectation that you must respond in a particular way or else. In those moments, there can be a quiet pressure to override what you sense internally, to set aside that inner voice and trust the certainty of the person speaking instead. When emotional manipulation is mistaken for spiritual authority, people don't grow in discernment. They grow in dependence. And that, my friends, is a very different thing. The fourth is when belonging depends on exclusion. See, community is one of the most beautiful aspects of religion. That space where you can know and be known, space where you can be held, space where you feel like you are a part of something. But that beauty can shift when belonging starts to depend on who is outside. When identity becomes shaped more by separation than by connection, more by drawing lines than by deepening love. Over time, the question quietly changes from how do we become more whole to something like how do we stay distinct? I often refer to this as the peculiarity plague. This subtle but powerful need to prove that we are set apart. And when that takes hold, the focus shifts from becoming more human, more whole, to simply being not them. And that shift can narrow the heart instead of expanding it. What often follows, almost inevitable, is that this need for distinction begins to shape more than just social identity. It starts to shape belief itself. Doctrines, creeds, systems of interpretation, they can slowly become markers of separation rather than pathways to meaning. The fifth is when fear replaces love as the driving force. Fear can be a powerful motivator. Fear of being wrong, fear of consequences, fear of not measuring up. And for a while, fear can produce compliance, but it rarely produces depth. Because a spirituality that is rooted in fear tends to become rigid, anxious, and fragile. Whereas a spirituality that is rooted in love creates space for honesty, for growth, and for return. And when fear becomes the dominant tone, people may stay, but they don't always flourish. Now, before we call it a day, let's recap the 5 ways religion can begin to drift away from spiritual depth. Number 1, when certainty replaces wonder. Number 2, when performance replaces transformation. Number 3, when authority replaces conscience. Number 4, when belonging depends on exclusion. And number 5, when fear replaces love. See, none of these happen all at once. They happen slowly. I might even say subtly, and at times without intention. Because often these patterns are inherited, they are normalized, they are passed down as this is just how things are done. And over time, people learn to adapt to them rather than question them. And so the drift doesn't feel like a rapture, it feels more natural. Until at some point, something within us begins to sense that what once felt alive no longer feels the same. As per the norm around here, if you want to explore this conversation deeper, the extended reflection is available on Patreon. And just as I'm thinking about it, there is one more big way through which religion drifts away from spirituality. I'll talk about that one also on Patreon, and I'll leave the link in the description below. As always, thank you for being here, because learning how to recognize what nourishes the soul and what slowly erodes it truly matters.
Faith was never the end, but a doorway we must walk through. What once held wonders slowly learn to speak in answers. We performed the sacred while the soul stayed untouched. It takes courage to step beyond borrowed meaning into something lived and true. Faith was never the end, but a doorway we must walk.